Earth Institute member from the School of Art History and Cultural Policy, and also a long-standing relationship with the Urban Institute, which was one of the precursors, the Earth Institute. So it's great to have you here, Fiona. So Fiona, you come via Trinity, Harvard, and now back to UCD, and you're coming with a really interesting new ERC research project, bringing together architectural history, music, military history, acoustics. So it'd be really interested to find out more about what you're doing. So
thank you, Will. And yep, back to my roots, and it's really, really nice to be back here. I remember when the coffee morning started in the Urban Institute when I was a PhD student, and I think it was around 2008, and we used to have cake and do the cryptic crosswords. And it was just such an amazing, collaborative, brilliant place to work. And I suppose for me, it was the beginning of interdisciplinary work, the first chance I had to see my own ideas being reflected back to me through different lenses from other people, and to be exposed to other priorities and different mores and different disciplines, and to kind of really have the chance to see how different perspectives can shape a research project. And I suppose my career has been built on interdisciplinary work ever since then. And I think it's fair to say that all of that came out of the Urban Institute. And I wouldn't be standing here today with an ERC if it hadn't been for that spectacularly supportive and collaborative environment. And it's really nice to see that, you know, things have changed, buildings have changed, surroundings have changed, but that lovely ambience, that sense of support and dynamism that always permeated the Urban Institute is still here. And it's just really, really great to be back. So you'll forgive me while I... Thank you. So before I get into the overall ERC project, I might just tell you very briefly what it is in general that I do. I look at acoustics and specifically the history of acoustics, why spaces, particularly complex spaces, sound the way they do. Like this one you might recognize as Christchurch. And in looking at the history of acoustics, I've also looked at how experimental methods evolved in measuring those spaces, or in exploring ways to quantify the intangible or the phenomenal. And in acoustics, I suppose, cathedrals, they're about as complex as you can get. So on this slide, we have Fred the head, who is a binaural microphone. Fred has two tiny little microphones set really deep into his ears, so that when Fred records sound, you get a much more realistic representation of what it is that a person would hear. And you can assess the difference between what is heard between the left ear and the right ear. So you get a much more realistic sense of the impact of walls on what you hear. So Fred, have I gone too far? Yeah. Fred is sometimes a member of the congregation, and sometimes he's an organist. And this photo was taken by Paul Kenny, who was in the Urban Institute when I was there, in St. Albans Cathedral. Fred kept a close eye on everything I did as a PhD student. Most of the work was in cathedrals, as I said, and most of it was in the middle of the night. And the reason for that is that it was quiet in the middle of the night, and there was less chance that noise would impact on any measured data. And noise, I suppose, is one of the fundamental strands of this ERC project. Because while the project is about silence, you can't really acknowledge silence without noise. So that early work, which was about measurement methods and experiments in cathedrals, has just become a book. Pistols in St. Paul's, it's still about cathedrals, a few more buildings thrown in. Really, it's about experimental work in the 20th century, and acoustics has been about manipulating spaces, perhaps so that you hear things that what you're looking at that doesn't necessarily correspond to what you would expect to hear when you're looking at a space. And that is another root strand to this ERC. that sense of disconnect between what you see and what you hear, and how it can be manipulated. So the ERC project is called Spectres and Camouflage, and at its heart, it's about the technological search for the silent environment in the 20th century. And by this, I mean acoustically manipulated environment, not the type of silence that you find in nature or in the architecture of previous centuries, like monasteries or places for reflection. This is much more about harnessing 20th century science and technology to shape an artificially silent environment. Like this one, which is an anechoic chamber. So you might be familiar with anechoic chambers. The word anechoic means free from echo, and it was coined during World War II in one of these chambers, which was at the time being used for military purposes by the US. It was 1955 before the word anechoic actually began to be used regularly in the literature. Up to then, they were referred to as dead rooms or raw rooms or free field rooms. And the aim of an anechoic chamber really is to achieve as silent an environment as possible, and to hourly give this sense of limitless space, although you're in a very limited envelope. So they have these massively thick walls that you can see here. This is the door for one that was built in 1963. It's 4 foot deep. The door is the same width as the walls. And these foam wedges, well, at the time they were plastic, are designed to absorb sound along the principle of gradual transition. So basically, while the walls are tremendously striking, tremendously massive, to one of the senses, they don't exist. You can't hear the space. You feel like you're in outer space, or at least that was the design intention behind them. They're really quite dramatic spaces to be in. I mean, they're not just visually striking, but they're also quite cold. You can imagine how much thermal insulation comes with a 4 foot thick wall. Everything feels very kind of disconnected. You can't hear any background noise. You hear, as John Cage pointed out, your heart rate. And that floor, this sort of gossamer mesh that hovers above those wedges, it's kind of bouncy to walk on. So it's really not feeling very grounding, shall we say. And I suppose the feeling of being in an anechoic chamber is a sort of a mixture of a brutal and a fragile space. I mean, an anechoic chamber is the only room I've ever been in where I worried that if I fell over, I might damage the room rather than damage myself. But while they've always been designed for silence, they've had quite a sensational history or a sensational association. And they've always retained this essence of sort of the cutting edge, particularly when it comes to music and media technology and studies in acoustics. So you have possibly heard of John Cage's symphony, Silent Symphony, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which was inspired by an anechoic chamber. And that's a piece of music where the start is signaled by lifting the lid of the piano, and the end is signaled by closing the piano. And John Cage's intent was to show the audience that silence doesn't really exist. It's a construct. It's not really there. And that has been the sort of, I suppose, that is the point at which anechoic chambers began to be associated with music and the avant-garde. In that sense, the same chamber that John Cage experienced his epiphany that inspired this work was used in World War II as essentially a blank canvas, a sound laboratory where they developed an early form of multi-track recording using recordings that had been taken in Fort Knox and adding them together to create a realistic soundscape of battle, and this was used as a decoy on the front lines in World War II. So these are sort of the snapshots of anechoic chambers, the different ways in which they've been used. We just see them as snapshots. There hasn't really been an overarching study that links together the different ways in which anechoic chambers have been exploited, the different ways in which they've been designed. Because while at first glance they all look the same, they have these massively spiky walls on the inside and they're quite dramatic spaces. Each one, throughout the course of history, there have been different stages of development, whether it's as simple as rotating the wedges on the wall to homogenize the acoustics a little bit more, or figuring out how to adapt the load-bearing capacity of that gossamer floor so that it can accommodate a 3-ton lorry or a full orchestra. There have been different ways of looking at them, different ways of analyzing them, and different ways of designing and constructing them. And this project is really about drawing together the different strands of that history and looking at how knowledge was transferred across disciplines, across countries, between people, and also how knowledge was transformed as it moved between disciplines and as it moved back again. Because the very first use of an anechoic chamber was as an acoustically neutral environment for assessing insulation, sound insulation for dwellings. Noise was a big problem in the interwar years. Data was increasingly necessary for building standards. So the first real impetus to develop an anechoic chamber was to assess sound insulation for housing. And they've moved on and they've moved back. And the chamber I showed you in 1963, that was designed again for housing to assess complex constructions, fully, I suppose, floors and partitions. It had to be big enough to accommodate entire floors and entire partitions to measure sound transmission through full structures rather than just isolation materials. So it's moved on and it's moved back and it's changed quite a lot. And to explore this, I suppose, the ERC project is in 4 different work packages. 3 of them are specific disciplines. So we have architecture and construction, war and global conflict, music technology and acoustics. And then the 4th work package, framework and connections, links all of these together. And in tying the overall project together, there are a number of sort of cross-cutting research questions that probably apply to most, if not all, of the work packages that are sort of like points to come back to as we go. I think I'm running out of time, am I? Am I still okay? Okay, great. So we're looking at formal as well as informal transfers of knowledge. We're looking at tacit forms of transfers of knowledge, which is that sort of transfer of knowledge that you get by doing or by exposure. It's sort of hands-on knowledge. And we're looking at forced transfers of knowledge, as in the intellectual reparations after World War II, or patents that were appropriated, not always in a very straightforward manner. We're also looking at the different ways in which this technology for silence was used in war and in peace. So on either side of the war, it was used in different ways. It was used, as I mentioned, for the ghost army and terrestrial warfare. It was also used as to develop an invisibility, a sonic invisibility cloak for submarines and in the design of marine test chambers. Looking at the sort of intertextual relationship between music and architecture and how that sense of an acoustically neutral environment was exploited, or how it was applied in contemporary acoustics in convolution and in predicting what spaces would sound like in the future, spaces that were still on the drawing board. And we're also looking at tensions. Tensions always exist. And finally, the 7th crossover research question is voices. Whose voices were heard and whose ears were given priority. And I'm going to show you in the next slide, I'm going to skip that one actually. This is the first anechoic chamber, and just on the topic of voices. From what we've seen so far in the earliest work on anechoic chambers, women did play a role, but it was a role in manufacturing. It wasn't a role in conceptualizing. And by the 1960s, I think we've come across our first woman who had a major conceptual role in, who worked in computer programming and was beginning to look at the potential of anechoic chambers in combination with computers for simulating acoustics. So we're really looking at that trajectory again throughout the whole project. At what point did different voices come into play, or what weight was given to different voices? So there are three primary objectives to the project: to bring to light this trajectory of development, to situate that technological search within the broader lexicon of cultural and scientific history in the 20th century, and to develop a framework to accomplish this. So my final slide is the same as the first one. This is a chamber that was built in 1963. And the span of the project, as you'll see up here, goes from 1938 to 1970. So the woman who was building an anechoic wedge, that was in 1938. This chamber in 1970 was the first in the world to accommodate a full orchestra. The recording that was made 1969, 1970 was still in use 40 years later for predicting the acoustics of concert halls. So this particular chamber has had a legacy that we still hear and that we still experience in major concert halls around the world. Obviously, they couldn't support a full chamber orchestra on this floor. So they had lost the slides. If you could see that tiny little table that the technician was standing on, adjusting the speaker, that was the ultimate solution, to create these little tabletop solutions that slotted in between the wedges with only so much space as would naturally be exposed space, as would naturally be expected in an orchestra platform. So it was kept very tight, very confined, bolted to the floor through the wedges and braced underneath so that there was no real impact on the acoustics of the space. And that, I suppose, that's the final point of the project. So we're looking at everything that happened in between those two. Thank you.